Part 1. Dr. Vexel had spent 42 years studying how different species conducted scientific research. As the senior for the Galactic Academic Oversight Committee, had observed researchers from 847 different species across 12 spiral arms of the galaxy, had seen the methodical Ev, who planned every experiment down to the smallest detail before beginning, had studied the collectives, who shared thoughts directly and worked as one massive brain, had even documented the crystalline entities, ancient beings who experienced time differently and could spend centuries on a single research question without growing impatient. None of them had prepared for humans. The first reports had arrived 3 years ago, transmitted from a small research station orbiting 442b. A human team had been given a standard 30-cycle grant to study how certain life forms survived near volcanic vents on the planet's surface. This was normal. The grant timeline was generous. Most species would have used the full 30 cycles and perhaps requested an extension. The humans had submitted their preliminary findings in 4 cycles. Had assumed this was an error in the data transmission. Perhaps the humans had misunderstood the assignment. Perhaps they had submitted incomplete work. But when reviewed their findings, everything was there. The research was thorough. The methodology was sound. They had simply done 30 cycles of work in 4 cycles, and no one on the human team seemed to think this was unusual. The committee had discussed this at length. They had reached no satisfying conclusions, so they had done what academic committees always do when faced with a mystery. They had designed an experiment. The next human research team to apply for funding received a modified grant. Instead of 30 cycles, they were given 15. The committee waited to see what would happen. Perhaps the humans would protest. Perhaps they would request more time. Perhaps they would explain that their previous speed had been a special case. The humans finished in 3 cycles. This was when began to feel the first stirrings of genuine concern. Something was wrong with the data. Something had to be wrong. Cognitive resources were finite in all known species. There were mathematical models that described exactly how long research should take based on complexity, available resources, and the biological limitations of the researchers involved. The human results did not fit any of these models. They did not even come close. The committee approved a more aggressive test. A human research team on Mars was given a deadline that the committee's own analysts had calculated to be physically impossible. The work required would take a minimum of 20 cycles. The humans were given 8. When the results came back, tentacles had curled so tightly that 2 of them had gone numb. The humans had finished in 6 cycles. They had not only met the impossible deadline, they had beaten it by 2 full cycles. This was when the committee had approved proposal for a direct observation study. Would travel to a human research station and watch them work, not through remote sensors or transmitted data, but in person. Would embed with a human team during what the humans called a crunch period. This was apparently a regular occurrence in human academia, a period of intense work leading up to a major deadline. The humans spoke of these periods with a strange mixture of dread and something that almost sounded like anticipation. 3 other researchers would accompany on this mission. The first was a ETH statistician whose mathematical models were considered the most accurate in the galaxy, had designed most of the cognitive resource equations that the humans kept violating. The second was Dr., a behavioral psychologist who specialized in stress responses across different species, had studied how 200 different species reacted to pressure and time constraints. The third was Entity 7, a crystalline being who perceived time in ways that other species could barely comprehend. Entity 7 had agreed to join the mission because they found the human relationship with time to be, in their words, deeply confusing. Their destination was the Prometheus Research Station on Europa, one of the moons of the humans' gas giant. The station housed 43 human scientists who were studying the possibility of life in the moon's subsurface ocean. They were 3 weeks away from a major funding review that would determine whether their research would continue or be shut down. The journey to Europa took 12 days, spent most of this time reviewing everything known about human biology and psychology. Humans were not particularly remarkable as a species. They were carbon-based, oxygen-breathing, and relatively fragile compared to many spacefaring races. Their brains were sophisticated but not exceptional. Their sensory capabilities were average. Their physical strength was unremarkable. On paper, there was nothing about humans that should have allowed them to outperform species with superior cognitive architecture. And yet the data was undeniable. The Prometheus station was smaller than had expected. It was a collection of interconnected modules built beneath the ice, protected from the radiation that constantly bombarded Europa's surface. The humans who greeted them at the airlock looked tired. This was normal for humans, had read. What was less normal was that they also looked excited. Dr. Sarah was the station's lead and the head of the research team. She was a small human with dark hair pulled back from her face and circles under her eyes that suggested she had not slept recently. When she shook primary tentacle in the human greeting gesture, her grip was firm despite her obvious exhaustion. "Welcome to Prometheus," she said. "I hope you don't mind if we keep working while you observe. We've got a lot to do before the review board meets." Assured her that this was exactly what they had come to see. The station's main laboratory was a long room filled with equipment that only partially recognized. There were standard spectral analyzers and sample processors, but there were also devices that appeared to have been modified in ways that voided their warranties. One machine had been partially disassembled and rebuilt with components that clearly came from 3 different manufacturers. When asked about it, a young human researcher named explained that the original design had been too slow for their needs, so they had improved it. "Is that safe?" asked. Shrugged, "Probably." This response would have been unacceptable in any other research environment had ever observed. Among the equipment modifications required 17 forms and a safety review that took at least 2 cycles. Among any change to established protocols required consensus from the entire collective. Even the crystalline entities, who cared little for physical safety given their nearly indestructible forms, insisted on careful documentation of any procedural changes. The humans appeared to modify their equipment and procedures continuously, documenting these changes in handwritten notes that they stuck to the walls with adhesive strips. And the other observers set up their monitoring equipment in a corner of the laboratory where they could watch without interfering. Immediately began running calculations, trying to predict how much work the humans would accomplish based on standard cognitive models. Doctor activated sensors that would monitor the human stress hormones and brain activity. Entity 7 simply watched, their crystalline form reflecting the laboratory lights in patterns that suggested deep contemplation. For the first 3 hours, nothing particularly unusual happened. The humans worked at a steady pace, running experiments and analyzing data. They talked to each other constantly, sharing information in quick bursts of conversation. They drank coffee, a human beverage that had read about but never seen consumed in such quantities. The station's coffee machine appeared to be the most heavily used piece of equipment in the entire facility. Then at hour 4 something changed. A message arrived from Earth. The funding review board had moved their deadline forward by 1 week. What had been 3 weeks of remaining work time was now 2 weeks. The humans gathered around Doctor as she read the message aloud, watched carefully, expecting to see despair or perhaps anger. Instead, something strange happened to their faces. Their expressions shifted in a way that translation software struggled to interpret. The closest approximation was determination mixed with something that almost looked like grim amusement. Doctor looked at her team. "Well," she said, "I guess we're not sleeping this week." Several of the humans laughed at this, did not understand why this was funny. Then the humans went back to work, and began to realize that everything the committee thought they knew about cognitive limitations was about to be proven wrong. Part 2. The first thing that noticed was the change in pace. Before the deadline announcement, the humans had been working at what seemed like a reasonable speed. They had taken breaks to eat and rest. They had engaged in casual conversation. They had moved through their tasks with focus but not urgency. After the announcement, everything changed. The casual conversation stopped. The breaks became shorter and less frequent. The humans began moving with a different kind of energy, their bodies seeming to operate on some reserve power that had not known existed. Within an hour of receiving the news, the entire laboratory had transformed into something that reminded of a hive species in full defensive mode. Calculations began showing errors almost immediately. "This is not possible," the statistician muttered, adjusting sensors and running new models. "Based on their current output rate, they are producing results approximately 3 times faster than my models predicted. Their cognitive system should be degrading under this level of stress. Instead, they appear to be accelerating." Doctor was equally confused. The psychologist's monitoring equipment showed that the humans were experiencing massive spikes in stress hormones. Their cortisol levels were elevated to the point where most species would begin experiencing cognitive impairment. Their adrenaline was spiking repeatedly. By every metric that Doctor knew, these humans should have been shutting down. Instead, they were running 3 experiments simultaneously. Focused on Doctor, watching her move through the laboratory with a kind of focused intensity that was almost frightening. She had been awake for 19 hours when the deadline change was announced. Over the next 12 hours, she did not sleep at all. She barely sat down. She consumed 6 cups of coffee and ate a small package of something she called trail mix without ever stopping her work. By hour 31 without sleep, Doctor should have been experiencing severe cognitive impairment. Human biology was well documented. Their brains required regular periods of unconsciousness to function properly. Without sleep, their reaction time slowed, their decision-making degraded, and their ability to process new information collapsed. Watched Doctor simultaneously run 3 spectral analyses while mentoring a junior researcher named on proper sample handling procedures, while also reviewing a report that another team member had sent her for approval. She caught an error in the spectral analysis that would have missed. She explained a complex concept to in terms that were both accurate and easy to understand. She suggested 3 improvements to the report that the author immediately agreed were necessary. None of this should have been possible. "I need to talk to you," said to Doctor during a brief moment when the humans were focused on a particularly delicate experiment. "What is happening to their brain activity?" Doctor's sensors flickered with confusion. "I do not know how to explain what I am seeing. Their brains have entered a state that does not match any pattern in my database. They are experiencing high stress, but the stress is not impairing them. It is as if their consciousness has narrowed to a single point of focus, and everything that does not serve their immediate goal has simply been shut off." "Is this sustainable?" asked. "Absolutely not," Doctor replied. "They will crash eventually. Their bodies will force them to stop. But the fascinating thing is that they do not seem to know this. Or perhaps they know it and simply do not care." Entity 7, who had been silent since their arrival, finally spoke. The crystalline being's voice resonated through the room like a struck bell. "I have been observing their relationship with time. It is unlike anything I have experienced in 3,000 years of existence." Turn to face Entity 7. "What do you mean?" "Most species perceive time as a river," Entity 7 explained. "It flows in one direction at a constant rate, and they flow with it. Some species resist the current more than others, but all of them acknowledge that the river exists and that they cannot change its speed. These humans—" Entity 7 paused, their crystalline form shifting colors as they searched for the right words. "These humans seem to believe that the river is optional." Before could ask for clarification, A loud alarm sounded from somewhere in the laboratory. One of the sample containers had cracked, and liquid was leaking across a workstation. 3 humans converged on the problem immediately, their movements coordinated without any apparent communication. Within 4 minutes, the leak was contained. The samples were transferred to a backup container, and the damaged equipment was being repaired by a human named Jackson, who had apparently taught himself mechanical engineering during a previous crunch period. "Did you see that?" asked, their statistical models now showing nothing but error codes. They did not discuss who would do what. They did not assign roles. They simply moved together as if they were one organism. Doctor nodded. "I have observed this in hive species, but those species share a biological connection. These humans are all individuals with separate consciousness, and yet, under pressure, they seem to form temporary connections that allow them to function as a single unit." Watched as the humans returned to their work without celebrating their success or even acknowledging it. The crisis had been handled. That was all that mattered. They immediately moved on to the next task as if the near disaster had never happened. At hour 48, the first human collapsed. A researcher named Tors simply stopped moving in the middle of a sentence, swayed slightly, and would have fallen if had not caught her. 2 other humans immediately took over her work while a third guided Tors to a small room with a cot. "She'll be back in 4 hours, Doctor said, noticing's concerned observation. "She just needs a quick nap." 4 hours did not seem like nearly enough sleep for someone who had been awake for 2 days. But sure enough, exactly 4 hours later, Tors emerged from the rest room and went directly back to work as if nothing had happened. Her cognitive function appeared to be fully restored, which contradicted everything new about human sleep cycles. At hour 52, something remarkable happened. Doctor gathered her team for what she called a quick sync, and the humans spent 15 minutes sharing information about their various projects. But they did not speak in complete sentences. They communicated in fragments, half-thoughts that other team members would finish. One researcher would begin to describe a problem, and another would interrupt with a solution before the problem was fully explained. They seemed to know what each other was thinking before the thoughts were expressed. "They have developed a temporary shared language," Doctor observed. "Look at their brain patterns. They are synchronizing their neural activity through these brief meetings. The more stressed they become, the more connected they appear to be." Notice something else as well. The humans were laughing, not constantly but frequently enough to be significant. They made jokes about their exhaustion, about the impossibility of their deadline, about the failures and setbacks they encountered. After the sample container cracked, Jackson had said something about the universe personally attacking them, and everyone had laughed for almost 30 seconds. "Why are they laughing?" asked. "Their situation is objectively stressful. They are facing potential failure of their research program. Why would they find humor in this?" Entity 7 offered an answer that had not expected. "In my observation, the laughter serves a mechanical function. It releases tension from their bodies, allowing them to continue functioning under pressure that would otherwise break them. It also reinforces their connection to each other. Each shared laugh is a reminder that they are not facing this impossible task alone." At hour 58, the station's primary data server failed. Watched the humans gather around the malfunctioning equipment. They had 3 months of data stored on that server, 3 months of samples analyzed, experiments run, and conclusions documented. If the server could not be repaired, they would lose everything they needed for the funding review. This thought was where the impossible deadline would finally break them. Doctor stared at the server for a long moment. The other humans watched her face, waiting for her reaction. The silence stretched for almost 10 seconds, which seemed like an eternity in the context of their accelerated work pace. Then Doctor said, "Well, that's not great." Several humans laughed. One of them, a researcher named Park, cracked his knuckles and said, "I guess we're rebuilding from backups." The backups are incomplete, Tors pointed out. We've got maybe 40% of our data saved. Then we rebuild the other 60% from memory and partial records, Doctor said. We've got 2 weeks. Who remembers the Wheeler experiment results? Multiple hands went up. Watched in disbelief as the humans began reconstructing 3 months of work from memory, fragment files, and what they called rough notes. They did not panic. They did not despair. They simply accepted that their task had become even more impossible and continued working. This was the moment when began to understand that humans did not experience impossible deadlines the way other species did. Part 3. The observation mission lasted for the full 2 weeks leading up to the funding review. During that time, and the other documented 847 pages of notes, recorded thousands of hours of sensor data, and still felt that they had barely scratched the surface of understanding human behavior under deadline pressure. The humans had rebuilt their lost data. This alone should have been impossible, but they had done it through a combination of partial backups, handwritten notes, personal memory, and what one researcher had called educated guessing based on scientific principles. Their reconstructed dataset was not identical to the original, but it was close enough to support their conclusions for the funding review. They had also completed all their remaining experiments. They had written their reports. They had prepared their presentations. And they had done all of this while averaging less than 4 hours of sleep per night and consuming enough coffee to fuel a small spacecraft. The funding review happened on the final day of the observation period, watched from the back of the room as Doctor presented her team's findings to a panel of senior human scientists who had traveled from Earth for the occasion. The presentation was excellent. The data was compelling. The conclusions were well supported. When the panel announced that the Prometheus station would receive continued funding for another 5 years, the humans cheered. Some of them cried. Several of them hugged each other in the strange human gesture of physical comfort. Doctor smiled for the first time in 2 weeks and noticed that her hands were shaking slightly from exhaustion. Then, almost immediately, the humans began to collapse. Not dramatically, but systematically. One by one, they announced that they were going to sleep and disappeared into their quarters. Within 3 hours of the review's conclusion, the laboratory was nearly empty. The humans who had seemed invincible just hours ago were now sleeping so deeply that even the station's alarms could not wake them. They are experiencing biological payback, Doctor explained. Their bodies are forcing them to rest and recover. The stress hormones that sustained them are now crashing. They will likely sleep for extended periods and experience various physical symptoms as their systems return to baseline. Nodded, still processing everything they had witnessed. The journey back to the Galactic Academic Oversight Committee's headquarters took 12 days. Spent most of this time working on the report, trying to translate what they had observed into language that the committee would understand. It was not easy. The phenomena they had witnessed did not fit into any existing academic framework. Had abandoned their statistical models entirely. The mathematician now believed that human cognitive performance could not be predicted using standard equations, because humans did not acknowledge the variables that those equations assumed were fixed. It is as if they have discovered a way to temporarily rewrite their own biological limitations, said. When faced with an impossible deadline, they do not calculate whether they can succeed. They simply assume they will succeed and work backward from that assumption. The impossibility becomes irrelevant because they refuse to factor it into their calculations. Doctor had developed a new theory about human stress responses. According to the psychologist, most species experience stress as a warning signal that told them to slow down or stop. Humans apparently experience stress as a fuel source. The more stressed they became, the more energy they could extract from their biological systems. This was not sustainable in the long term, but in the short term, it allowed them to accomplish feats that should have been physically impossible. Entity 7 had the most philosophical interpretation. The crystalline being believed that humans had evolved a unique relationship with time itself. Most species accept that time is a fixed constraint, Entity 7 explained during one of their discussions on the return journey. They work within the time they are given. They expand their work to fill available time or reduce their goals to match available time. Humans do neither of these things. When given insufficient time, they somehow compress the time they have. They pack more moments into each moment. They experience time more densely than other species. Is that possible? Asked. Entity 7's crystalline form shimmered with uncertainty. I would have said no before this mission. Now I am not certain. The humans accomplished 2 weeks of work in 2 weeks, but they also accomplished 6 weeks of work in those same 2 weeks. The mathematics should not allow for this, and yet it happened. When they arrived at committee headquarters, the report was classified at the highest level. The implications were too significant to share widely. Summary presented 3 main conclusions. First, human scientists operated on what had termed deadline-induced temporal compression. When faced with impossible, humans did not process the impossibility as a limitation. They processed it as a challenge to the nature of time itself. This was not a conscious strategy. It appeared to be a deep-seated psychological trait that humans had developed over generations of academic work. Second, humans had evolved social mechanisms that allowed them to function as a collective organism under extreme pressure. Their ability to synchronize their work, communicate in compressed fragments, and support each other through shared humor created a resilience that individual humans would not possess alone. A single human facing an impossible deadline would fail. A group of humans facing an impossible deadline would somehow succeed. Third, and most importantly, this ability came at a significant cost. The humans had observed would require weeks of recovery time. Their bodies and minds had been pushed far beyond sustainable limits. Several of them would likely experience health problems as a result of their extreme effort. The impossible deadline had been met, but the price had been paid in human. The committee discussed these findings at length. They considered the implications for interspecies academic collaboration. They debated whether human methods could be taught to other species. The answer to that last question came from the failed attempts that had already been made. Several species had tried to replicate human deadline protocols in controlled experiments. The results had been uniformly disastrous. A team of researchers, attempting to work under human-style time pressure, had experienced cascading system failures. Their carefully organized minds could not handle the chaos that humans embraced. A test group had entered catatonic states when faced with impossible deadlines. Their collective consciousness had simply shut down rather than attempt something it calculated to be impossible. Most dramatically, a crystalline entity who had volunteered to experience human-style time compression had actually shattered. The physical stress of trying to pack more time into less time had destroyed their crystalline structure. Humans, it seemed, were uniquely adapted to this particular form of suffering. Its final recommendation was simple but significant. The committee should never give humans reasonable deadlines. This seemed counterintuitive at first. Surely, giving researchers adequate time to complete their work would produce better results. But the data suggested otherwise. When humans were given reasonable deadlines, they became complacent. Their work expanded to fill available time. They lost the sharp focus that impossible pressure created. They became, in a word, ordinary. When humans were given impossible deadlines, they became something else entirely. They became forces of nature. They bent time and broke cognitive limits and achieved things that no other species could match. The cost was high, but the results were undeniable. The committee voted unanimously to accept its recommendation. All future grants to human research teams would include deadlines that were calculated to be just slightly beyond the edge of possibility. Not so impossible that the humans would give up before starting. just impossible enough to activate whatever strange mechanism allowed them to transcend their limitations. The vote was controversial among some committee members who felt that deliberately pressuring researchers was unethical, but the humans themselves seemed to prefer it this way. When had asked Doctor whether she would rather have had a reasonable deadline, the human scientist had actually laughed. "Where would be the fun in that?" she had said. Still did not fully understand human humor, but perhaps that was appropriate. Some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved. The final addendum to this report was a personal observation that the committee chose not to include in the official record. Had noticed something during the last hours before the funding review, something that did not fit into any scientific framework. The humans had known, on some level, that they might fail. The server crash had nearly destroyed them. The shortened deadline had pushed them to their absolute limits. There had been moments when success seemed genuinely impossible. And yet they had kept working, not because they were certain they would succeed, not because they had calculated the odds and found them favorable. They had kept working because stopping was simply not an option they were willing to consider. There was a word for this in the human language. They called it stubbornness, or sometimes they called it hope, or sometimes they called it just too stupid to quit. Whatever it was called, had never observed anything like it in any other species, and suspected that this quality, more than any biological or psychological mechanism, was the true secret of human achievement under impossible deadlines. They succeeded because they refused to believe they could fail, and somehow, against all evidence and probability and scientific understanding, that refusal was enough. Closed the final report and sent it to the committee archives. Somewhere out there, in research stations across the galaxy, human scientists were facing impossible deadlines right now. They were drinking coffee and making jokes and pushing themselves past every reasonable limit. And they were winning. The universe had given humanity a challenge it could not possibly meet, and humanity had looked at that challenge and said, "Well, that's not great. Let's get to work."